The question is that the bill be now read a second time. The member for Solomon.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on the Classification, Publications, Film and Computer Games Amendment Online Games Bill of 2011. This bill, as the member for Stirling said, seeks to establish clarity around the classification of mobile phone and online games by providing a 2-year moratorium on the formal classification of online games. The proposed amendments to this bill will see the insertion of a new category of exempt online games into the Classification Act, which removes the requirement for mobile phones and online games to be classified. The Coalition supports the bill, which seeks to simplify the classification process of online games and the self-regulation amongst the telecommunications industry, pending the results of the Australian Law Review Commission. It's worth noting that it has been some 20 years since the Australian Law Reform Commission was required to give a reference relating to censorship and classification. In the 20 years hence, the Australian community, as a result of the rapid advancement of technology in terms of online media, has access to a plethora of applications that are now available, for example, on their iPhone or iPad. And the member for Stirling was talking about Angry Birds. I've not played that, but I've seen many people on the planes playing that game. Globalisation of media in the complicated modern communication space requires legislation, particularly to do with the classification that must be adaptive and reflective of advancing technology. The feasibility for the Classification Board to trace online media content is impractical when a large proportion is distributed from offshore. Classification information available to the community must be improved. The Coalition supports such improvement in the understanding that, in particular, parents require information so they can make informed decisions when allowing their children to be exposed to social media or to online media, which includes the purchase and participation of online games. I know as a parent myself, I've always used the movie classification as an important part of my decision-making process, and I fully support the call to improve classification information. Technology has advanced exponentially, so much so that today's consumers have access to an ever-increasing variety of online games that are available on many platforms, including, as I've said, mobile phones, iPads, iPods and other similar electronic network devices. Currently, the classification of mobile phone and online games are regulated under the National Classification Scheme, as the member for Stirling had said. This cooperative scheme between the Commonwealth, state and territory governments contains the procedures for classifications of mobile phones and online games, but the responsibility to enforce this legislation remains with the state and territories. A large number of mobile phones and online games which are currently available to the public are not classified before being made available and therefore are potentially in breach of current state and territory legislation. Now, this is of considerable concern to the Coalition, particularly when you consider that there are thousands and thousands of applications each month for licensing with Apple products alone. So when established, there was never an expectation of the level of content currently available that the National Classification Scheme would be involved in processing. In consideration of the current legislation, it is clear that the Classification Board does not have the administrative resources to access even a portion of the mobile phone and online games that would be submitted for classification. The telecommunications industry has expressed concern about the current regulatory uncertainty, and they require clarity on the present legal requirements for the classification of mobile phone and online games. This bill seeks to amend the Principal Act to create a much-needed category of exempt online games and, as a result, remove the requirement for mobile phone and online games to be classified for a 2-year period. The drafters of the current legislation could not have foreseen the significant and rapid development of gaming technology, particularly of online games and mobile phone applications. The aim of this bill is to provide understanding in terms of the regulations for mobile and online games for which the local industry and community can understand. It is the intent that the industry can still submit these types of games to the Classification Board of Australia for classification, but importantly will no longer be, as the member for Stirling said, in violation if they do not do so, as the industry will be required to self-regulate under the proposed 2-year moratorium. The proposed changes to the Act are intended to remain in place for the 2 years, after which long-term reforms to combat these issues will be established following the recommendations made by the Australian Law Reform Commission after its review of the National Clarification Scheme, which is expected to be finalised in 2012. Now, the Coalition believes it is important to ensure that the proposed exemption will not apply to computer games which are likely to contain offensive material and would normally be refused classification. It is highly important that existing protections against the category of offensive material will continue to apply to online games. Children today are already overexposed to violent and immoral images through their widely unrestricted ability to access the internet and online games. There is a strong feeling within the community about introducing R18+ ratings on video games such as Grand Theft Auto. I must say, I was shocked when I first saw teenagers playing Grand Theft Auto. This is a game that players score points by stealing cars, bashing policemen and displaying violent sexual behaviour towards women. Now, I'm by no means a prude, but I do have some concerns about a game that promotes bashing policemen and being violent to women. And I don't think this is the type of game our young people should be playing. And I have in this place already raised my concerns about the increased level of violence and lack of respect to our police officers. And with games like Grand Theft Auto being so lifelike and being available, I suspect, but I may be wrong, that there may be a link, there might be a slight link somewhere between violent games and the increased violence within our community, particularly towards our police officers. I certainly do think that this has to be one of the contributing factors and believe that the classifications are an essential tool in assisting parents to make some key decisions. The classification of online games like Grand Theft Auto is absolutely essential, as I've said, to help provide better information and advice to parents to help prevent their children and teenagers from accessing games that may contain gratuitous sex, violence or drug use. I know that when my son was growing up, my husband and I reviewed all of his console games and movies to ensure that they were appropriate for his age, and as a teenager he was not allowed to access games or movies that we considered to be unsuitable. The classification level was a key consideration in these decisions. In some circumstances, there is arguably a need to restrict access to some online gaming content on the basis of our community standards. Now, the Coalition understands that a large majority of the games played online are played by adults, and as such they have the capacity to make up their own mind as to whether they can play games that contain content. As the member for Stirling had already stated, stakeholders including Apple accept that policing the output of this type of material in the traditional sense is near on impossible. Having said that, it is understood that Apple take great care in compliance monitoring of its products before making them readily available for wider distribution. The Coalition knows it's essential to keep many of the other regulatory protections in place, and under the Broadcasting Services Act, individuals can lodge a complaint with the Australian Communications and Media Authority when they are concerned that an online game contains prohibited material. The Director of the Classifications Board will still retain the power to investigate any computer games that it suspects contains contentious material that likely requires the game to be classified at a higher than an M rating. Ideally, outcomes from the Australian Law Reform Commission's findings would see measures recommending streamlined financial and regulatory processes for the telecommunications sector, whilst providing clear and precise classifications for the gaming industry and the wider Australian community. The significant increase in volume and variety of online games has made the existing classification regime impractical. The Coalition does support the 2-year moratorium on formal classification for online games, pending the recommendations of the Australian Law Reform Commission. Whilst the Coalition supports the bill, it is our firm belief that it is essential that any refused classification material not be subject to the moratorium. We must continue to balance the rights of adults to make informed choices with the protection for our children. This legislation will require the telecommunications industry to self-regulate their products, and that they will still face sanctions for the incorrect classification of inappropriate material that they make readily available to consumers. It is absolutely vital to reform the current classification framework in Australia. Otherwise, we can run the risk of damaging our creative industry in the ever-increasingly globalised media environment. Now, as my colleague, the member for Stirling, has already said, the Coalition does support this bill.